September 28, 1944. Ngesebus Island, Palau. The Japanese defenses were a masterpiece of precision. Every trench measured, every gun zeroed in on the narrow causeway that linked the island to Peleliu. For weeks, Major General Imamura's men had watched the horizon, certain they had built the perfect trap. Mortars bracketed the crossing. Machine guns formed interlocking webs of fire. Even the tides had been studied to predict when the Marines would strike. No commander could possibly ignore such an obvious approach. And that was the problem. Colonel Bucky Harris wasn't following the manual. While Japanese spotters waited for the first silhouettes to appear on the causeway, the real attack was already moving through the island's interior. A silent force threading through coconut groves and coral ridges the defenders believed impassable. When the first explosions echoed from behind their lines, the Japanese never understood what had gone wrong. The perfect defense had met an enemy who refused to play by the rules. The trap was perfect. Every gun was in place. Every range had been measured to the yard. The Japanese had spent weeks waiting for the Americans to walk into it. But when the thunder of naval artillery began rolling across the Pacific, it wasn't coming from where they expected. It was coming from behind them. On the deck of the command vessel, Colonel William Bucky Harris watched the dawn unfold across the narrow spit of coral called Ngesebus Island. Through his field glasses, the terrain looked deceptively calm, shimmering. Sand, low vegetation, and the fragile thread of a causeway connecting it to Peleliu's northern tip. But beneath that stillness was death. He could see the outlines of reinforced gun pits, mortar emplacements, and interlocking bunkers. The Japanese had turned that 50-yard causeway into a funnel of fire. Harris lowered his binoculars and glanced at the map table beside him. 470 Japanese troops, each dug in with machine guns, mortars, and artillery calibrated to cover that strip of land like a scythe through wheat. Every approach had been pre-registered for indirect fire. The intelligence report didn't exaggerate. It was a fortress designed to kill Marines. "Every weapon they've got is pointed straight at that causeway," Harris muttered. Captain Walter Stout, his operations officer, studied the aerial photographs spread across the table. "It's the shortest route," he said grimly. "Straight across from Peleliu. Doctrine says that's our entry point." "Doctrine," Harris said, "gets Marines killed." Around them, preparations continued with military precision. The sea was alive with movement, LVTs rocking in the morning swell, their engines coughing to life. Crews checked machine guns, tightened straps, and secured gear. Farther out, the USS Iowa and USS New Jersey were already pounding the northern beaches. The 16-inch guns fired with a rhythmic violence that shook the air itself, sending fountains of coral dust skyward. Overhead, F-4U Corsairs circled like dark birds of prey, waiting for the signal to strike. It was the same choreography the Marines had followed since Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, the same playbook that had cost thousands of lives. Harris had read the Japanese like a mirror image of himself. They had studied every American landing, every pattern, every habit. They knew what to expect. That causeway was not a battlefield, it was an abattoir. Sergeant John Red McCauley climbed up onto the deck, his helmet tucked under one arm, his face carved by salt and fatigue. He'd fought in 3 landings already and had the wary eyes of a man who trusted instinct more than plans. "Colonel," he said, "the boys are wondering about the landing site. They can see those guns as clear as day. It doesn't look good." Harris turned his gaze southeast toward the open ocean. Beyond the reefs, the sea shimmered under the early light. It was rougher water, no cover, no natural landing point. The beaches there were smaller, narrower, farther from the main objective. But the reconnaissance photos told a different story. Few fortifications, scattered observation posts, barely a platoon's worth of defenders across 2 miles of shoreline. He made his decision then and there. "We're not taking that causeway," Harris said. His tone was final, calm. "We're going to hit them from the sea." The officers nearby exchanged uncertain glances. A shore-to-shore assault from open ocean was practically unheard of. It meant navigating heavy surf, fighting against currents and landing without the concentrated fire support that standard doctrine demanded. It was the long route, the hard route. But it was also the one route the Japanese hadn't prepared for. Stout raised his binoculars again, studying the rolling breakers along the southeastern coast. "We'll be wide open the entire approach. If they see us early, they won't have time," Harris cut in. "Their heavy guns are locked on that causeway. To swing those batteries around takes hours. We'll be ashore before they can react." He tapped the map, tracing the faint curve of the coastline. 50 men covering this entire stretch. We'll break through, roll north, and take them from behind, while they're waiting for Marines who never come. Macaulay gave a tight grin. "They'll be facing the wrong way when the real fight starts." "Exactly," Harris said. "Let's make them regret studying our old battles." Within minutes, orders rippled through the fleet. Signal flags rose on masts, radios crackled across frequencies. The battleships shifted fire toward the southeast. Beaches. Air squadrons adjusted flight plans to hammer the interior positions. Every movement rewrote the script of the morning. At 0630 hours, the first wave of amphibious tractors churned through the swells. Harris rode with Stout's company in the lead vehicle, spray slashing across the windscreen. Behind them, 24 more LVTs followed in staggered formation, engines roaring against the push of the tide. The sea turned from dark blue to turquoise as they neared the shallows. In the distance, white plumes of naval shells erupted inland, flattening bunkers and sending shock waves through the coral ridges. From here, the thunder of the Iowa's big guns sounded different, muffled by distance but steady as a heartbeat. Inside the Japanese command bunker overlooking the causeway, Private Tatsuji Ishida wiped the dust from his periscope lens. The bombardment was intensifying, but it made no sense. The shells were falling far from the narrow land bridge where the Americans were supposed to attack. "Too far south," he murmured. "They're missing the target," his sergeant snorted. "Typical American gunners. No discipline." Outside, the causeway lay silent under the rising sun. Machine gun crews waited behind their weapons. Mortar teams crouched beside neatly stacked shells. Every gun was zeroed, every field of fire perfected. They had rehearsed this moment in their minds 100 times. When the Marines came, they would die within 50 yards. But the sea to the southeast was alive with movement, and no one in that bunker was looking that way. 2 miles down the coast, Macaulay's LVT slammed onto the beach, treads grinding, over wet coral. The ramp dropped and Marines splashed into waist-deep surf. The resistance was exactly as Harris had predicted. Sporadic rifle fire, a few panicked bursts from lightly manned posts. These weren't defenders ready for a major assault. They were lookouts caught off guard. "Go! Go!" Macaulay shouted, waving his men forward. Bullets hissed overhead, but most went wide. The Japanese in this sector had no heavy guns, no overlapping fields of fire. Within minutes, Marines were fanning out across the sand, establishing a foothold where the enemy had expected nothing. Behind them, another wave of LVTs punched through the surf. The landing that should have been suicide was turning into a masterpiece of misdirection. From his position in the command vehicle, Harris watched the smoke rising over the island and allowed himself the smallest nod of satisfaction. For once, they weren't walking into a Japanese plan. This time, the Japanese were walking into his. The fight for Ngesebus Island had shifted from chaos to choreography. The Japanese defenders, caught between disbelief and defiance, were still firing in the wrong direction. Their heavy guns waited for ghosts that would never appear on the causeway, while from the southeast, real Marines were already carving through their rear lines. The first defenders Harris's men encountered were armed with little more than rifles, a handful of machine guns and a few aging mortars. They fought like men who understood the odds but refused to yield. Bursts of fire cracked through the humid morning air, bullets stitching palm trunks and coral outcroppings. Yet courage alone could not stop the weight of a full Marine battalion. Stout's company advanced methodically, every move drilled by months of training. Flamethrower teams surged forward under covering fire, their weapons hissing as liquid fire swept through bunkers. Demolition men followed, planting charges in the blackened openings to finish what the flames had started. The rhythm of battle became mechanical, a brutal efficiency that matched the island's industrial defenses. Every bunker that fell widened the breach. Within minutes, platoons were fanning out through the coconut groves, turning natural cover into tactical advantage. Imamura's carefully engineered defense, built to crush an attack from one direction, was being dismantled from another. The beaches Harris had chosen, dismissed by Japanese planners as too rough for a landing, were now alive with reinforcements and supplies. It had been a calculated risk for both sides. Imamura's staff had believed those shores were secure precisely because they were so inhospitable. But Harris had gambled on the unthinkable, and it was paying off. By 0700 hours, 3 marine companies were ashore and pushing inland. The element of surprise had turned to dominance. Radio intercepts crackled aboard the command ship. Broken Japanese transmissions, overlapping orders, panicked voices asking for confirmation. They were trying to make sense of a world that no longer matched their maps. The first organized counterattack came from the island's center, where a reserve company had been held in readiness. Private Tatsuji Ishida, a 20-year-old infantryman, found himself sprinting through undergrowth he had never expected to fight in. Sweat slicked the stock of his rifle as he stumbled over roots, heart hammering against his ribs. The maps they'd been given showed this terrain a secure rear area, no fire zone. Now it was alive with gunfire. By the time Ishida's unit reached the outskirts of the grove, the Marines were already there. Automatic rifles flared from unexpected angles. Grenades exploded in the trenches meant to protect the reserves. The defenders tried to regroup, but their static doctrine betrayed them. They had been trained to hold fixed positions, not to maneuver. Against mobile, battle-hardened Marines, they were simply targets. Within 20 minutes, the counterattack dissolved. The jungle stank of cordite and burnt vegetation. Pillboxes that had once commanded the seaward approaches now became coffins, their firing slits useless against attackers coming from behind. Machine gun emplacements oriented toward the causeway couldn't pivot fast enough to meet the new threat. The battle Imamura had planned never happened. The one he hadn't imagined was tearing his defenses apart. Macaulay's squad hit the fiercest resistance at a coral ridge, where a reinforced bunker housed the island's communications hub, the link to Imamura's headquarters on Peleliu. The structure had been built to survive naval bombardment, not a flamethrower creeping up its blind side. Under a curtain of suppressive fire, a Marine carrying a 60-pound fuel tank advanced step by step, sparks flashing in the muzzle light of his weapon. When the pressurized flame roared through the firing slit, the bunker erupted. A column of black smoke clawed into the sky. The island's radio went silent. Cut off from command, Japanese positions began fighting as isolated outposts, each one unaware that the others had already fallen. What had been a coordinated defense turned into a mosaic of last stands. By 0830 hours, Harris's unconventional plan had achieved the impossible. A secure beachhead, minimal casualties, and control of the high ground, all without setting foot on the fatal causeway. The very terrain designed to slaughter Marines now served as protection against Japanese artillery that could no longer reach them. Harris looked through his field glasses, watching the smoke curl from burning fortifications. The causeway guns still stood silent, their barrels aimed toward empty surf. They built the perfect trap, he said quietly to Stout, and then stood inside it. At 0900 hours, he ordered the next phase. Stout's company pivoted north and began the deliberate destruction of Imamura's fortifications. The bunkers that had once promised impregnable defense were now open wounds in the coral. Each was approached from the rear, cleared, and left, smoldering. The Japanese had built their fortresses to face seaward, massive concrete fronts reinforced with steel and stone. But the rear walls, meant only to deter infiltrators, were weak. Thin steel doors, camouflage netting, and narrow maintenance tunnels offered no protection against Marines carrying satchel charges. The first strong point fell in minutes. One squad laid down suppressive fire while Macaulay's team crept around the blind side. A sharp hiss, a burst of flame, then a muffled explosion. When the door finally swung open, smoke and silence spilled out together. The defenders who emerged were dazed, burned, and unarmed. The battle they had trained to fight had vanished. The enemy was everywhere except where they had expected. What should have been an all-day siege became a sequence of 10-minute victories. The momentum was unstoppable. Private Ishida's mortar team was among the few still operational. Their pit overlooked the causeway, its concrete lip lined with shell casings. For days they had rehearsed their role, to rain fire on the Americans, as they charged across the strip. Now their field of fire pointed toward nothing. When Ishida heard movement behind him, he turned and saw shapes advancing through the smoke. The Marines were already inside the perimeter. The mortar was useless. Its fixed angle could not target the jungle. Panic surged through the pit. Ishida clutched his rifle, torn between duty and survival. The first whoosh of a flamethrower decided. For him. He dropped his weapon and raised his hands, stumbling out into sunlight that burned his smoke-stung eyes. Another fortress had fallen. Another fragment of Imamura's design erased. By 1,000 hours, Harris's men controlled the southeastern beaches entirely. What had once seemed a liability, the long, exposed approach across open sea, had become a lifeline. LVTs ferried ammunition, stretchers, and reinforcements in steady rhythm. The tide that was supposed to drown them now carried their victory. Ahead lay the final resistance. The massive bunkers and coastal guns guarding the northwest coast, the true heart of Imamura's defense. These were the monsters. Concrete. Fortresses housing Type 96 coastal artillery, capable of hurling 150mm shells 10 miles out to sea. Each had been engineered to repel the heaviest naval assault, but none were built to fight the enemy behind them. Harris split his battalion into assault teams. One element pinned the defenders with suppressive fire, while the other circled wide through the groves and coral ridges. The ground shook as demolition charges tore open ventilation shafts. The sound rolled across the island like distant thunder. When Macaulay's squad reached the largest bunker, they found its rear door sealed with a steel plate meant to stop saboteurs. A shaped charge pressed against it erased that distinction. The explosion blasted the door inward, filling the tunnel. With dust and shock waves, inside the gun crew staggered, ears ringing, eyes wild. They had trained to sight warships through rangefinders, not to fight infantry with rifles inside their own gun pit. Within minutes, the cannon that had once threatened the U.S. fleet was silent forever. Each captured position became a stepping stone to the next. The Marines moved like clockwork, clearing, burning, advancing. The Japanese defenders, still brave and disciplined, fought on in fragments when a handful here, a bunker there, but the coherence of their defense was gone. At 11:30 hours, Imamura's surviving troops made their final bid to retake the island's central ridge. It was a desperate gamble, 3 ad hoc groups, cobbled together from survivors, of shattered units, cooks, clerks, and signalmen. The plan was brutally simple: charge across open ground, overrun the Marine perimeter, and seize the high ground controlling the beaches. If they could not win, they would die trying. Ishida, miraculously, still alive, found himself among them. His uniform was torn, his hands blistered from the earlier fires. Around him the remnants of the garrison crouched in silence, waiting for the signal. When the whistle blew, they rose as one and surged forward. Machine gun fire met them almost immediately. The ridge erupted in sound. The harsh chatter of Brownings, the deeper thud of grenades, the scream of mortars. Men fell by the dozen. Still they ran. For a moment the air was a storm of smoke and shouting, the chaos of men who refused to surrender to inevitability. Macaulay's Marines held their fire until the last possible second, then unleashed everything. The line rippled with muzzle flashes. The ground in front of them disappeared into dust and flame. The charge broke apart, fragments scattering into cover that didn't exist. When it was over, the field was silent, except for the low hiss of burning grass. Ishida lay face down, unhurt but deafened. Around him, the survivors dropped their weapons. The battle that had begun as a perfect plan had ended as a ruin of smoke and shattered concrete. By noon, organized resistance on Ngesebus Island had ceased. Harris walked the ridge his men had secured, the heat shimmering off blackened coral. Below, the sea glittered as more landing craft approached, bringing supplies instead of soldiers. He looked toward the north, where the causeway still stretched empty between the islands. Not a single Marine had crossed it. The Japanese guns that commanded it stood untouched, useless monuments to a doctrine that had died that morning. Harris removed his helmet, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Sometimes," he said to Stout, "the smartest move on the board is the one they've never seen before." Stout nodded, watching the smoke drift toward Peleliu. "They'll see it now." "Maybe," Harris said quietly, "but not in time to stop it." The perfect defense had collapsed under the weight of imagination. Success would mean restoring the defensive line and trapping the Marines between the sea and the shattered remains of Ngesebus Island's fortress. Failure would end everything. By mid-morning, the island's fate balanced on that edge. The terrain itself seemed to favor the Japanese. The central ridge, riddled with coral caverns and hand-cut tunnels, provided hidden paths between positions. Weeks of labor had turned natural rock into an underground web where soldiers could move unseen, reappearing behind Marine lines like ghosts. To clear them, Harris's men would have to fight the kind of battle every infantryman dreaded. Close, suffocating combat where flamethrowers and grenades replaced artillery and tanks. Sergeant Macaulay's squad held a patch of shell craters near the crest. From there, the ridge fell away toward the north and west in a maze of broken coral and scrub. He could read the ground the way a hunter reads tracks. The faint depressions that betrayed a tunnel mouth, the way a patch of dead grass marked a hidden vent. Each cave was a potential ambush, each shadow a possible muzzle flash. The first warning came as a faint metallic ping, one of the tripwires Macaulay had strung from wrecked Japanese field phones. A second and third wire snapped in quick succession. He didn't need to speak. His men were already flattening themselves into the craters, safeties off. The counterattack had begun. From 3 directions, Japanese infantry surged up the slope. They moved low and fast, using the coral's uneven surface for cover. Machine guns opened from hidden recesses, the bullets slapping dust into the air. The Marines answered with disciplined bursts, their rifles cracking in short, controlled rhythm. Captain Stout coordinated the defense from what had once been Imamura's observation bunker. The irony wasn't lost on him. American voices now traveled down the same underground phone lines the Japanese had built to direct their fire. The network that once connected the island's defenders now served their conquerors. The fighting around the ridge grew into a brutal stalemate. The Japanese had no artillery left, but they still had courage and an intimate knowledge of every cave and trench. Type 96 light machine guns chattered from invisible positions, their fields of fire intersecting like the spokes of a wheel. Each Marine movement forward drew answering volleys of rifle fire from the darkness. The smell of cordite and burning coral hung heavy in the humid air. Harris moved constantly along the line, helmet tilted back, voice calm despite the chaos. Every few yards he knelt to speak with a squad leader, adjusting sectors of fire, coordinating flamethrower teams, shifting reserves. The battle's rhythm was measured in seconds. Advance, suppress, fall back, and advance again. Then came the turning point. A flamethrower team crawled to within 20 yards of the main cave complex, the anchor point of the Japanese line. The operator, a young corporal from Kansas, had already cleared a dozen bunkers that morning. He moved with the deliberate grace of a man who understood exactly what his weapon could do. As he squeezed the trigger, a torrent of flame roared into the tunnel mouth, painting the interior in incandescent light. For a moment, the cave became a furnace. The heat and pressure ignited munitions deep within the network, sending a shockwave that lifted dust and debris across the ridge. When the smoke thinned, the guns had fallen silent. The heart of the Japanese defense had been burned out. Private Ashita stumbled from a side tunnel 50 yards away, his uniform scorched, his weapon lost. The air shimmered with heat as he collapsed on the coral, coughing out soot. Around him, what had begun as a coordinated counterattack was disintegrating into fragments. Small groups of survivors fled toward the northern tip of the island, clinging to the illusion that one more ridge, One more bunker might hold. By 12:20 hours, resistance had collapsed into chaos. The Marines advanced with methodical precision, clearing each position as they went. Flamethrowers sealed caves that refused to yield. Demolition teams followed, planting charges that turned bunkers into smoking craters. The fight that had begun as a desperate defense ended as a mechanical, routine target. Clear, move on. When the guns finally fell silent, the numbers told their own story. 470 Japanese dead or captured, 15 Marines killed, 33 wounded. On paper, it looked impossible. On the ground, it was the visible proof of what innovation could do to doctrine. Colonel Harris stood on the ridge, surveying what was left of Imamura's fortress. Around him, shattered concrete bunkers lay open like broken eggshells. Gun barrels, twisted skyward, still hot from the last exchange. In 6 hours, an island that had taken weeks to fortify had ceased to exist as a fighting position. The lesson was as clear as the smoke that drifted toward Peleliu. The old rules no longer applied. Every textbook on amphibious warfare insisted on one path: hit the nearest beach, cross the shortest distance, overwhelmed by firepower. But Harris had chosen imagination over orthodoxy, and the result was victory at a fraction of the expected cost. Captain Stout walked through Imamura's former command bunker, its walls blackened by smoke. Maps still hung from the walls, their red grease pencil markings showing the very routes the Marines had never taken. The Japanese had predicted everything, except originality. Their entire defense had been engineered to stop the previous war, not the one being fought now. Harris's officers documented the remains methodically. The coastal gun that once threatened American ships was reduced to a twisted mass of steel. Type 96 machine guns were disassembled for intelligence teams. The tunnels that had connected the island's defense were collapsed with explosives. What had been the perfect kill zone was now a graveyard of obsolete doctrine. For the surviving Japanese, the end came without ceremony. Ashita and a handful of others were rounded up near the southeastern beaches, the very sands their commanders had dismissed as unassailable. They sat in silence, watching Marines unload supplies from amphibious tractors that moved freely across the stretch of water once considered impossible to cross. During interrogation, captured officers spoke of disbelief. They had been trained to expect the frontal assault, to die defending the causeway. None could explain how the enemy had appeared from inland or why their own artillery had fired uselessly into the empty sea. The intelligence reports that followed revealed as much about mindset as about material. Every Japanese bunker, every firing port, every communication line had been built with one assumption: that Americans would obey the logic of terrain. But logic was exactly what Harris had refused to follow. His decision to attack from the impossible direction had transformed every advantage into a liability. By late afternoon, the last charges detonated along the ridge, collapsing the remaining tunnels. Dust drifted across the coral plain, settling over a battlefield that had already begun to fade into silence. The Marines raised their unit flags where Imamura's banners had flown, signaling not just the capture of another island, but the triumph of adaptability over predictability. For the men who had fought there, Ngesebus was more than a tactical victory. It was proof that the Pacific War was being rewritten in real time, that ingenuity, not brute force, would decide its course. And somewhere beyond the smoke and wreckage, the sea glittered under the midday sun, indifferent to the lessons written in blood and fire along its edge. Conclusion. From the deck of his command ship, Colonel Harris filed his after-action report, as waves of LVTs ferried fresh troops and crates of ammunition to the newly conquered island. What had begun as a gamble on the map now stood as a blueprint for the rest of the Pacific campaign. Ngesebus had proven that victory didn't belong to the strongest or the most entrenched. It belonged to those willing to think differently. The Japanese had built their empire on the expectation that the enemy would always follow the book. Every trench, every pillbox, every gun emplacement had been designed for a predictable war. But Harris had torn the playbook apart, and with it, the illusion of invincibility that surrounded Japan's island defenses. Across the Pacific, every commander studying Ngesebus would see the same truth. No defense can survive against imagination. As the sun rose over the battered ridges, the once lethal causeway now carried supply trucks instead of corpses. The perfect ambush had become a perfect lesson in adaptability. In less than 2 days, Harris hadn't just taken an island. He'd rewritten the doctrine of amphibious warfare. Because in war, as in life, it's not strength that wins, it's the courage to defy expectation. Subscribe for more untold stories of strategy, sacrifice, and the men who changed history.